Hi, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of Hidden History of New England. I'm your host, Patrick, and I want to thank you for joining me today. In this podcast, we're going to explore stories from New England's past that are often overlooked. Hidden gems that might not make it into your history books, but stories that I believe are just as important to understanding the region's complex past. For our first episode today, we're diving into a fascinating and thrilling story from pre-revolutionary America. It's a tale I find incredibly intriguing, and a tale that in many ways sparked ripple effects of resistance and defiance that would echo in the years leading up to the American Revolution. This is the story of the Pine Tree Riot of 1772. It's an event that epitomizes the struggles and frustrations of the colonists in the years before the break with England. It wasn't just about trees or lumber. It was about control over resources, land, and over what the colonists could and couldn't do with what was theirs. And it's a story that's not always told in your typical history book, which is exactly why I wanted to bring it to light here today. So, let's set the stage for the Pine Tree Riot. It's 1772 in the small New England town of Weir, New Hampshire. Just a few years before the outbreak of the American Revolution, tensions are already simmering between the American colonies and the British Crown. You have to remember that the Stamp Act and Townshend Acts have been stirring unrest, and the colonies have been growing increasingly resentful of British control, especially when it comes to taxation and trade restrictions. And in the small town of Weir, New Hampshire, that tension would soon explode into open defiance, sparking what would become known as the Pine Tree Riot. Now, that spark came when local mill owners found themselves pushed too far by a new twist on an old law, what was called the Broad Arrow Policy. Now, this law gave the British Crown first claim to any of the region's towering pines over 12 inches in diameter. And before we get into the specifics of the event, let's understand why this law was such a big deal. Because by the late 1600s, England's forests were being rapidly depleted. They had been using their own timber for years, primarily to build ships for their own Royal Navy. And we have to remember that this wasn't just any navy. This was one of the largest, most powerful fleets in the world. And these ships played a key role in securing England's dominance in many conflicts. Because of this, by the 17th century, England had come to rely largely on the Baltic region, Sweden, Norway, Russia, for a majority of its tall, straight pine masts. But the supply was costly and vulnerable to geopolitical shifts. And over time, Baltic imports were becoming less reliable and more costly. So Britain's naval and timber policies shifted towards the American colonies. The Crown came to see New England's majestic white pines as a very strategic asset. New England had an abundance of these strong, towering white pines. There were still thousands of acres of old-growth forests that were practically untouched, and the British saw an opportunity. So, in 1691, the British government passed the Broad Arrow Policy, and this first was on the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and it reserved for the Crown all trees of the diameter of 24 inches and upward, at 12 inches from the ground. And by 1698, this policy was extended to include the colony of New Hampshire. And as time went on, the law got stricter. And by 1722, the diameter requirement was reduced to just 12 inches. Now, this was a serious blow to the colonists, because suddenly, nearly every sizable tree in New England was considered property of the Crown, regardless of who owned the land beneath it. And to enforce this law, England created a new position in the colonies, what was known as Surveyor of the King's Woods. And these surveyors would travel around, inspecting trees to see if they qualified as royal property. And when a tree met the requirements, it was marked with what was known as a broad arrow, 3 strikes of an axe, a symbol of royal ownership. And this is where the friction started. Colonists had long been using these trees to build their homes, heat their fires, and create tools and furniture. And suddenly, they were being told, those trees aren't yours anymore. For local sawmill operators, this was a huge blow. It was a direct threat to their livelihoods. These trees were essential to their businesses, their homes, and their overall survival. And with the crown now laying claim to even more of their resources, resentment boiled over. I mean, imagine the frustration. And it was just building over the decades. Not only did the colonists have to contend with taxes and trade restrictions imposed by a very distant king, but now the resources of their own land was being claimed by that same king. These trees represented a loss of independence and a loss of control over their own resources and their own land. And this boiled over with the first act of resistance, what was known as the Pine Tree Riot, and this occurred in the small town of Fremont, New Hampshire. In 1734, a local surveyor named David Dunbar was driven out of town when he was set to inspect local lumber. And citizens discharged a volley of gunpowder and dressed as Native Americans and attacked Dunbar and his men to drive them from the town. So luckily for years, this law wasn't heavily enforced in New Hampshire. But that was until 1766, when John Wentworth becomes governor. John Wentworth becomes governor, and he decides that it's time to crack down on this illegal logging. So in the winter of 1771, he orders a search of sawmills in New Hampshire, particularly in the Goffstown and Weir area, to look for protected pines. And the authorities uncovered a couple of mills that were illegally possessing trees marked with the broad arrow. And the mill owners, who had been caught red-handed, were slapped with hefty fines. But they decided not to pay, and instead hired a local attorney, a man by the name of Samuel Blodgett. And at first, Blodgett seems like a solid choice, respectable, capable, and potentially a strong line of defense. But then something unexpected happens. Governor Wentworth offers Blodgett the position of surveyor of the King's Woods. And, to everyone's surprise, Blodgett accepts. He switches sides, turning on the very people who hired him. And perhaps sensing that the tides were turning, the mill owners in nearby Goffstown chose to cut their losses, pay the fines, and move on. But not in Weir. In Weir, the mill owners, led by a man named Ebenezer Mudgett, decided that they weren't going to back down and pay. Mudgett was a man who, like many of his peers, had used these trees for generations, and to him the idea that a distant king could now claim ownership of the very land that he and his ancestors worked was infuriating. And like many colonists at the time, he saw this as part of a much bigger issue. It wasn't just about trees. It was about self-governance. It was about the right to control their own lives and their own resources. And eventually, a warrant was issued for Mudgett's arrest for refusal to pay his fines. And on the evening of April 13th, 1772, a Sheriff Benjamin Whiting arrives in Weir with his deputy, armed with a warrant for Mudgett's arrest. Mudgett is taken into custody, but he is soon released later that day on bail. And instead of waiting things out in court, that very night, Mudgett gathers a group of 20 to 40 men at his home, mostly local mill owners and citizens who are sympathetic to his cause, and they decide they're going to make a stand. They're not going to let this go any further, and they're not going to let the king, thousands of miles away, push them around anymore. And in the dark hours of the night, they gathered at Mudgett's home. A scene that must have been electric with anger and tension. I mean, I can just picture it. The low murmur of voices, the creak of the floorboards, the sounds of fists being clenched in defiance. The plan they made was simple but bold. They would march to the sheriff's lodging and run him and his deputy out of town. So they gathered their weapons, sticks, branches, clubs, whatever they could find, and they marched to the Pine Tree Tavern, the inn where the sheriff and his deputy were staying. And they burst into their room while they were both in bed. And what happened next was more than a beating. It was a symbolic act of rebellion. Sheriff Whiting later testified that he was terrified. He was certain that the men were going to kill them both. But instead, they were humiliated, and he and his deputy were forced to flee town. And while this wasn't exactly a full-scale riot, it was still a loud, clear message. The colonists were done with being controlled by a distant king, and they were done with being pushed around. And news of the Pine Tree Riot spread quickly. It inspired people in other colonies to stand up and resist, with events like the Boston Tea Party taking place only a year later. The Pine Tree Riot may have been small in scale, but its impact was far-reaching. So you may be asking yourself, what happened to the men involved in the riot? Well, they were eventually caught and put on trial. But the punishment wasn't as severe as you might expect for the time. They got small fines, relatively small. But the real message of the Pine Tree Riot wasn't in their fines. It was in the defiance. It was in the courage to stand up against a system that seemed unmovable. And as I see it, the true heroes of this story are the everyday people, the mill owners and the workers, those who stood up for what they believed in, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. They understood something important. It wasn't just about trees. It was about the power to control their own land and their own future. Their actions didn't just help to shape the state of New Hampshire, they helped spark the flame of resistance that would lead to the American Revolution. It's remarkable, really, how something that might seem small, a disagreement over trees, how it can represent something so much more. The Pine Tree Riot was about autonomy. It was about justice. And most importantly, it was about standing up for what was right. And maybe, just maybe, it's a reminder for us today about the importance of questioning authority, about standing up for what we believe in, and about the power we have when we come together as a community. So, as we wrap up this episode on the Pine Tree Riot, I just want to say thank you for joining me on this first episode of Hidden History of New England. This is a tale that speaks to timeless themes about resistance, about the right to self-determination, and about the everyday people who can make history. And who knows what other hidden stories are out there just waiting to be uncovered. Maybe this will inspire you to dig into history yourself. I'm Patrick, and thanks for listening. I'll see you next time on Hidden History of New England.